Dr. Lesley Shawler is a board-certified behavioral analyst and assistant professor at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Dr. Shawler's primary clinical and research interests include the functional analysis and treatment of severe, challenging behaviors exhibited by individuals with and without developmental disabilities. Specifically, she is most interested in improving methods to program and test for treatment generalization, as well as identifying the variables that can impact caregiver adherence to treatment. Dr. Shawler is also passionate about exploring conceptual questions within experimental and applied behavioral analysis, verbal behavior, and single case research methodology, and is interested in systematically examining these areas within her research.
All right, so the topic that I thought would be, a little bit more resonant for you guys is about research and generality, and just talking about bias and what some people refer to as questionable research practices that are prevalent. I mean, I'm talking about it kind of in the right vein of my science, which is applied behavior analysis, but I also am talking about it kind of broadly as well. Specifically, once we kind of jump into it, I will go over more about single case design, which is the methodology that we typically use when we're talking about single case studies or case studies, as you may be more familiar with that term. But really the area of bias in research or questionable research practice is definitely ubiquitous across all science. So even though we're mainly talking about psychology, and in this case, applied behavior analysis more so, I'm sure you guys would agree that it's pretty much prevalent in all sciences, unfortunately. So just kind of keeping that in mind. So here's just a brief agenda. Depending upon time, I may have to end at questionable research practices just because I'm not sure how long it'll take to get through all the slides, but I end on what's called a functional analysis, which is basically just an example of a couple of the things that I'll talk about before that. So I figure if we run out of time, then I'll just end before giving the example. And then if there is time, then great. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I always like to throw in Skinner quotes just whenever I feel like it's relevant to what I'm talking about. And this is one of the popular ones, but also one that I always think is a super interesting one and kind of falls in line with a lot of the things that I talk about when I talk about experimentation and research. Is just that, if sometimes you are investigating something, and sometimes we jump down these rabbit holes where we're like, oh, I'm really looking at this, but all of a sudden, I encounter another topic that is like tangentially related, and then all of a sudden, an hour later, I'm like totally looking into some other topic that maybe has some relevance, but sometimes has absolutely no relevance to what my original topic was. And so I think that is, a good, I guess it can be a good and a bad thing in some cases. I guess if you're pressed for time, it's not really a good thing, but I think in some cases it is a good thing because it introduces you to other topics that maybe you didn't necessarily know that you were going to be interested in. And sometimes it kind of just serendipitously happens, right? So I think the area of like questionable research practices and bias is something that, again, I wasn't like one day I woke up being like, oh, I'm interested in bias and research. It just kind of, I got steered in that direction based on some of the other work that I was doing. But then once I started thinking about it more, I did discover that it's really like a common thing, in all areas of the research that I already was doing. I just wasn't necessarily thinking about it in that way. Like I wasn't thinking about, could what I'm saying or doing be interpreted as, being biased in some ways by specific audiences. And so I think it's been helpful to, just kind of have that perspective and think about it in whatever areas of research. And again, it doesn't matter, what topic of research, it can be applied to any area. So it's been kind of an interesting, I guess, path and discovery just to learn more about it over time. So really quick, I just wanted to do a brief overview of single case experimental designs, because I know that not everyone is in this audience may not be familiar with it. So it's a little bit different than when we talk about, between subjects or group designs, because we're talking about behavior change at the individual level. So really looking at an individual organism, whether that's an animal or whether it's a person, but we're looking at behavior change over time. And so often you'll see some kind of graph that looks like this. So it could be like a line graph, and you're really looking at behavior change over time. So on the y-axis over here, you can see responses per minute, and then you can see that I'm looking at these data in terms of what the baseline levels were, and then when I added treatment, what the behavior reduction looked like, and then I did what's called a replication, where I went back to baseline and then back to treatment. And usually, like I said, this is done in small n groups, so that's also something that's a little bit different, is that I'm looking at the individual behavior of maybe one organism, and then if I have the availability to do it or accessibility to do it, then I might look at it across multiple different people, but it's still, usually within 3-4 people, and that's typically considered like a larger sample when it comes to single case design. That is changing a little bit. So sometimes, people will comment like, oh, it would be great if you could do this more, like have 5, 6, 7 kids or 5, 6, 7 adults, but that's not always feasible depending upon, if I had a very complex diagnosis, like let's say I had a diagnosis that's really rare and I was, just happened to have a individual that had that diagnosis, it might be very difficult for me to find 3 more people that have that specific diagnosis, get access to them, have them, be in Carbondale, Illinois. And so it may be very difficult to achieve that, but it just depends, right? If it was something that's a little bit more common, like, I don't know, like aggression or, maybe autism or ADHD, then that of course might be a little bit more doable. So it just kind of depends on the context and what I have access to. But here you see what we consider within subject replication. So like I mentioned, you have your initial baseline and treatment phases, and then we repeat those 2 exact phases. And so we get what's called within subject replication. So replication of treatment effects for the same individual. So that's one way that we look at replication. But we also look at it across individuals too. So like I said, if I had one participant and I demonstrated strong treatment effects, I may find another participant that is similar, do the same exact thing. And if I were to find the same results, then I could say that I have a cross-subject replication, meaning that I demonstrated it across multiple people, and I could do that multiple times, depending upon, again, what I have access to, and if there's people that have common similarities, whether it be diagnoses or behaviors or whatever the commonality might be. So that brings me to just talking about replication a little bit more broadly. So generally we have a couple different categories of replication. So, I just realized, hold on, I'm going to skip to the next slide, because that is redundant to the slide I was just showing. I like this graphic because it breaks it down a little bit more clearly, I think. But generally we have 2 categories of replication. One of our famous scholars in the field back in 1960 talked about the difference between systematic and direct replication. So this graphic, as we kind of go through it, will kind of show this a little bit as well. Direct replication is generally you have an initial study, they have their specific independent variables or specific dependent variables, and then you're just directly replicating that study and or part of the study with no significant procedural changes. So really, I just want to show, okay, Jacobs in 2022 did this study. I'm literally going to take that study and I'm going to do the same thing and then see if I get the same effects as whatever, Jacobs had in 2022. So that's what we consider direct replication. This helps to identify the reliability of a finding, right? So if 3 people replicate the same study and they all produce the same results, then it's likely that the original study was reliable because multiple people were able to demonstrate that across, different labs, ideally, different investigators and so forth. So next we have what's called systematic replication. So this varies from direct replication because in this case, we're intentionally evaluating the intervention, but we're making tweaks to some of the variables. So you can see here under number 3, we might vary the setting, we might vary the topography, which is basically what the behavior looks like. We might vary the participant demographics, and then also the behavior change agent. So maybe I completed a study with teachers, and then somebody comes along and they're like, oh, that's a really cool study, I'm going to replicate it. But instead of using teachers, I'm going to use caregivers, or I'm going to use group home staff, or whatever the case might be, right? So they're essentially taking my study and then they're replicating the procedures, but they're making what we call systematic changes. So they don't want to change everything, right? They're not going to change the setting and the behaviors and the diagnoses, because if there's too many changes, then if my procedures or my research findings aren't the same, I don't necessarily know why that's the case, right? It could be the setting, it could be the caregivers, it could be the behavior, but if I change too many things, then I'm not going to know what caused the difference in responding. Whereas if I make these systematic changes, then I can clearly identify, okay, I went from home to the school and then I got totally different results. It must have been that, there was some reason why this intervention didn't work in a different setting in this case. So this allows you to really look at the generality of procedures, right? So if I originally did the study in a school, then I, now replicated it in a home setting. If I do get successful results, then I can say that, the procedure is generalizable from one setting to another because I was able to demonstrate that. So together we look at, so we're thinking about our direct replication and then thinking about our systematic replications, combining those together ultimately over time, of course. So this, is an ongoing process that doesn't happen overnight necessarily. But we get this collection of studies that over time can become what we consider like a line of research, right? So people will start with an initial study, do some direct or systematic replications, and then, several years go by, and now all of a sudden we have this line of research where we've looked at different variables, we've tweaked them, we've produced the findings. Usually we'll, identify different questions within those findings, and that'll lead us to further research. And now we have, this whole line of research looking at a variety of, different things within the same topic typically. Ideally, we want this to be also replicated, not just in the same lab, right? So if all the studies come from just my lab, but nobody else is using my studies or replicating them, then that limits the generality, right? Because it's like, oh, only at SIU Carbondale are we seeing this one intervention and getting these results, but we're not seeing them, across the country or across the world, and that's obviously going to limit some of the generality of the studies. So ideally, other people are seeing this, and this is why we talk about publication and conference presentations and whatnot, right? Because we want to be able to disseminate what we're doing, and then ideally people say, oh, that's really interesting, I want to do that too, and then they start replicating and extending our studies.
Dr. Shawler, there was a question that someone had. It says,
Sure.
can you explain what a p-value means? Is it reasonable to have different p-values in a direct replication?
So usually p-values are more prominent in between group studies. So if I have like one group, it could be, a treatment group, and then another group that's like a control group, or it could be multiple treatment groups. So ideally they need to be a little bit larger than what you would have in like a single case design. So it's going to vary depending upon a lot of the questions that you're asking. But you would need it to be large enough that if you ran some kind of statistical analysis, that when you did those analysis, then you could compare the groups, right? So you would look at the means for one group, so the treatment group, you would look at the means for the control group, you would run some kind of analysis, and there's different kinds of analyses, so it depends on the study, and it depends on the research questions that you're trying to answer. And then you would look at whether the difference between those two groups are what's considered statistically significant. So you may have learned about that in some classes where it's like it needs to be p less than 0.05 or 0.01. And so if that difference is what we consider statistically significant, then that would mean that there's a difference between, in this case, treatment and control group, or two different treatment groups, depending upon what you've ran the analysis on. And then the second part of, hopefully that was clear, then the second part of that question is it reasonable to have different p-values in a direct replication? That's an interesting question. So part of what this is leading to is that sometimes people do complete direct replications of the same study and they actually don't find the same p-values. And so it could be that I run a study and I do have statistically significant differences between whatever groups I'm looking at. But then let's say you run the study and you don't. And so there's some other problems that I'll talk about in just a minute that can contribute to that. But that's part of, I think, what this replication crisis, so to speak, is kind of alluding to, is that sometimes we don't see those studies because they don't get published. Sometimes they get somewhat fabricated because people are, tweaking their data or maybe only sharing relevant parts of their data. So we'll kind of get into that discussion in a minute, but it is the case that sometimes people do, as close as they can tell from the article, almost exactly what the original authors did, and then do not get the same results. And so they find that the variables that they looked at are not statistically significant, or it could be the opposite. Maybe somebody reported that there was not a statistical significance between the groups, and then I came along and did the same study and maybe I found that there was. So either way it could work that way, but I think it's more likely that it's the first option where I do find, or where the original author finds significance and then the second or third or however many does not. So I think that would probably be more so what's reported or at least noticed, but it could happen technically in either direction. And I'll kind of circle back to that in just a couple slides. So let me know if you still have questions on that.
I just had a general question for you. Just if to get your opinion on, what do you think about a journal of null results for people to publish in?
I love that idea, and actually has come up in my field, so behavior analysis. It hasn't actually been like a real thing, like where we're actually having a journal now that we can do that, but people have posed that idea a lot, and I think a lot of people are starting to be open to it. I mean, I don't know if it's the majority, at least in my field, but people are becoming more and more open to it and accepting of it. It's just that it's still not, like, people are like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, but I still have yet to see an actual journal where that is actually a thing. But I think it's a great idea, and I don't know if it necessarily needs to be like, oh, we only send the studies that don't have significance here, but I think that there needs to be an outlet, like whether it's within the already existing journals and the journals just become more open to that, or if we need to have like a whole separate, like, these kind of studies get, kind of outcasted to this whole separate journal, whatever people would be open to. But I do think there needs to be some kind of outlet where those studies can go so that people can access them. So I do agree that that's a good idea. I just don't know exactly what people would be accepting of at this point. And it might vary by field, like people doing cancer research might be of one opinion, whereas like, people studying chemistry might be like, oh no, I have a whole totally different opinion. So I think it might have to vary depending upon the field of study, but versus just having kind of like a general, like every field will have a journal that does this. But right now, there's not really a great outlet in any field. So I think any kind of movement in that direction would be great. So good questions. Yeah, I think generally speaking, yeah, I mean, talking about what we consider this replication or reproducibility crisis. And here's a graphic from Nature. Oh, I meant to put, oh, here it is, from 2016, where they asked researchers, regarding their opinion on the reproducibility crisis. And you can see out of almost 1,600 researchers, half said there was a significant crisis, and then another basically 40% said yes, but a slight crisis. I'm sorry, I just realized this is really blurry, but a majority of people, as you can see here, agree that there is a reproducibility crisis. So what are some thoughts that you guys have as far as why? So majority of people, so I think it was almost 80%, over 80%, 90%. Sorry, I can't do math today. 90% said that there was one. So obviously it's a pretty widely held opinion. So what are some of the reasons that you guys have learned about, or just kind of general thoughts that you guys have about why we have this crisis?
Oh, wait, sorry, real quick. Matt Junker added something that you might find interesting. He brought up the file drawer problem, multiple DVs, selective reporting, hypothesizing after the fact without replication.
Yeah, great job, Matt. Yeah, so some of that you can see is on here. Hopefully, sorry, it's a little blurry, but so selective reporting is actually a very high percentage. So people were saying in the red that they thought it was always or often contributing to the issue, and then the pink color is sometimes contributing. So definitely, the top being the most, and then going from most to least. So selective reporting, pressure to publish, which is a problem, for academics, but also for, people in research institutes or hospitals where they have contingencies in place where they need to. And so that puts pressure on like, okay, well, I spent all this time on this study and now I need to get it out. And if I end up with results that, aren't going to be publishable, then that's going to be a problem, right? How do I not waste all this time that I just spent and still use the data for something, right? So that unfortunately puts unnecessary contingencies in place that then causes people to engage in unethical behavior at times. So there's other things on here like insufficient mentoring, poor experimental design, fraud, insufficient peer review. So there's multiple different areas. So selective reporting being a high one. And so that, basically pertaining to, I'm going to report the outcomes or the findings that are significant or that I find interesting, and I'm not going to report, these other data that I might have collected or might have gathered because maybe they don't align with my hypothesis, or maybe they just are not good data, they don't show replication. So I'm going to hide those data or just not report them and only focus on things that are in line with, other people's research or other hypotheses that make my research look good, right? So those are things that I think are commonly happening, and sometimes I don't know if it's necessarily people are thinking about it like, oh, I'm being biased. I think they're just kind of going through with, okay, well, these data are going to be what gets published, so I'm going to go ahead and focus on those data. So I mentioned the problem with being in environments like an institution or a university where you have these contingencies in place, right? It's like, oh, you're supposed to publish 2 to 3 articles a year. Obviously, if you end up spending time on research, you want that to count for something. And so that can lead to people engaging in unethical behavior. This article I thought was interesting just in the respect of they're kind of talking about it like, is it really biased, or is it just that, we're kind of brought up to think about negative results as like a bad thing, and therefore, we try to just not focus on those data and findings and try to instead just think about, okay, well, I'm going to just report the things that are significant or at least align more with my hypotheses and whatnot. So it's definitely a problem. Like I said, I don't unfortunately have a whole lot of solutions, but I, can definitely tell you about things that I've seen. I'm going to focus on one method just because obviously we don't have a ton of time today, but there is some other stuff out there that I do find interesting. But this is one thing that in my area of interest has been more of a relevant, I guess, area that I'm, looking into as far as my research goes. So this is something, I'm not sure if anyone has heard of this type of design, but it's what's called a consecutive controlled case series design. So outside of behavior analysis, which is my area, this type of design is prevalent in like medical sciences, like studies that, or I'm sorry, fields that have like a large number of patients or participants that are exposed to the same kind of procedures. So cancer is a good one. Like obviously a lot of people have cancer. A lot of people get exposed to very similar things, especially if you think about like clinical trials and stuff like that. So it makes sense. So if I'm going to try this new clinical trial, maybe I, run that with 200 people. I want to be able to see if I have all 200 of those people put their data together, and then I can really look at, what the effects were. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some other like specifics of this type of design in just a minute. But I like this because it does control for some of those things like publication bias, file drawer effect, and I'll get into more of like the nitty gritty in just a minute. But this is something that I think is very interesting and has a lot of promise. But with this type of design, so they're examining the general efficacy and generality of clinical procedures So it could be assessment procedures, it could be treatment procedures. It allows you to study the epidemiology and phenomenology, I have a hard time saying that word, of a clinical problem. So again, thinking like clinical trials, if I'm doing some kind of cancer research or some kind of, maybe I have a new vaccine or something, I can apply it to, a certain number in my group and then see what the effects are. You can compare the general efficacy if I have multiple groups or multiple treatments that I'm going to be looking at, and then ask experimental questions related to the generality of those procedures and processes. So there's some other neat components of this design that I think are helpful to just, like, again, get at this replication crisis bias issue that I mentioned. So one big thing is that you're going to evaluate all consecutively encountered cases that go through a certain procedure. So if I'm going to look at all people that had some kind of cancer, new treatment that came out, maybe there was like a 2 or 3 year clinical trial, all of the cases that encountered that specific treatment, whatever it might have been, are going to be included, whether the treatment was effective or not. So that helps to control for that selection or publication bias, right? So I might say from 2020 to 2023, all individuals that had this certain type of cancer, that had this certain type of treatment, are going to be in this data set, and I'm going to evaluate it regardless of outcome. And that will give me a better idea of, was this treatment actually effective, and not just only including those cases that were effective, right? Because that's obviously going to sample what my perspective of this treatment might be. You can do this in a prospective or retrospective way. So if I know that this is going to be happening, I can plan, right? So somebody tells me we're going to do this new cancer treatment from 2023 to 2025, I can plan this up front and say, okay, I'm going to, create the inclusion criteria. I'm going to only collect those cases that meet these criteria, et cetera, et cetera. Or it could be retrospective, right? So if this has already happened, or maybe at the tail end, then I can say 2020 to 2023, I'm going to look back and I'm going to find all those cases that meet, again, this inclusion criteria, and then I'm going to include them into my analysis and look at some of the specific variables and findings that were applicable to those cases. So again, looking at multiple cases within a group, right? So it could be a small group, it could be maybe 10 people had this, but it could be a larger group, depending upon whatever, the treatment or therapy might have been. It also allows you to preserve the data in a way that you can still look at individual outcomes rather than looking at group means. Because what happens when you look at group means? You lose the individual data that might be really helpful for you. Because if I have a mean that says overall, everyone responded on average to this treatment, it doesn't account for, well, maybe there was 10 people that actually didn't respond well, but they might get obscured within this mean, right? So it's important to be able to look at still the individual responders, because there may be these outliers of people that actually don't respond, and you wouldn't know that unless you had access to the individual data for these cases. And then, like I said, it's consecutively encountered. So if I say all individuals from 2020 to 2023 that all had exposure to this one treatment, I will literally take all of those cases, regardless of what happened, and there will be no screening out for people that dropped out. There'll be no screening out for people that didn't respond to the treatment. There'll be no screening out for any other variable that might typically be a reason for someone not to be included, as long as they meet, that initial inclusion criteria, and have some of these other characteristics that I'll talk about in just a second. So from the single case design perspective, which again is not always going to be what it is, but in my case, this is what's relevant for me. We would want some kind of single case design employed. We would want there to still be some kind of demonstration of experimental control, right? Because if it's a poorly designed study, I don't want it to be that, well, this person, maybe didn't have successful treatment effects, but that would be more of an artifact of the design, right? Not necessarily their response to treatment. So we want to make sure that people are still setting up these interventions in a rigorous way so that it's not a confound for the effect of the treatment in that case. There should be reliability measures. So we still want to make sure that the data are believable and reliable over time, not just like, oh, well, we just pulled these data, but we don't even know if they're actually reliable because we don't have measures for that. So we want to make sure that that's still being looked at. We want to make sure there's enough sessions or phases of the intervention. So obviously if they only came once or twice, that might not be a good candidate to be included because that really wouldn't tell you something versus people that come and endure for the entire treatment. There needs to be some kind of quantitative measure to document the magnitude of effects. So not just like a subjective, like, oh, they did really well, right? We actually want scores or measures in place where we actually have some data that can evaluate change over time. Some kind of measures of stability and trend. And again, like I said earlier, this would also include treatment failures. So that's not a reason for these cases not to be included. In fact, that is what this whole design is really looking for, is for including cases regardless of treatment failures. So again, we have this opportunity to really see how people are responding to, such and such treatment, and not those data not being obscured because they didn't respond to treatment in the way that people might have wanted them to. So as I mentioned, we're really looking for generality because we want to see, all these people that maybe have different, socioeconomic status, different sex, different nationality status, all these different things, right? They're all going to be included as long as, again, they're in that inclusion criteria that was set forth. And then we're going to be able to see if maybe there's individual differences across those variables. So it allows us to ask different questions that kind of get at this generality piece, right? It allows us to identify if there's any functional relations across the cases, and then also look at prevalence. So, maybe there's a certain percentage of African Americans that were looked at, or a certain percentage of Caucasians. It just depends on, again, what the eventual breakdown of all these demographics might be, but it allows us to, again, look at how generalized our treatment might be across different variables, depending upon what we're interested in. And then also to identify variables that may mediate the generality of clinical procedures. So of course, there's some treatments that we've seen, affect African Americans differently than Hispanic Americans, or affect differently than Asian Americans, or females versus males, right? So there's different things that can contribute to why certain treatments work in different ways across different variables, right? I think we've seen that with a lot of different things over time. So this is just an example of what, so in this case, if I had 32 different cases of a specific treatment that I looked at, you can see that we have it broken down by age, gender, race, in this case, the diagnosis, so like autism versus cerebral palsy versus intellectual disability. So you can see all these different demographics are listed here, the type of problem behavior they engage in, and then the function of the problem behavior, which we don't have to worry about that right now, but this basically just shows you an example of how you might take the cases that you were looking at, and then this would allow you to see, like, okay, for the males, is there a certain pattern of responding, for the females, for the Caucasian people versus the African Americans, and so forth. Here's just a couple examples of how, so depending again what your question is, you might be able to take different variables and then look both at means, but also you could look at individual data. So it just depends on how you want to depict your data. So you don't have to necessarily worry about what these data are saying per se, but this is just an example of my 32 cases I just showed you in that table, how we could look at different things based on the data that was presented, and break it down either at the individual level, like I said, we like to do, just so that we can see individually how people are responding, but you could also present them in means. So this kind of gives you a couple examples of what that might look like. So kind of to segue back, but I mentioned this a little bit earlier, just when we're talking about research practices. So what I just showed you, which again is the controlled consecutive case series design, is one methodology that might help at least control against things like publication bias, selection bias, file drawer effect, which is very similar to publication bias, but things where people are running experiments and then nobody ever sees the findings because they just go in the, quote unquote metaphorical file drawer, because people have learned that when they try to publish those data don't get published because people are like, well, you didn't have relevant findings or significant findings, so we're not going to be able to publish that, right? So that's a problem because it's still important to know that this intervention doesn't work, especially if it's with a certain population, because we don't want more people wasting their time and energy and money when it's already been determined that this intervention isn't going to be effective, right? So those things are important that people should be seeing them, but unfortunately, a lot of times, when we don't have significance, those things just get hidden and put in the file drawer, right? So some other research practices I think that are important to note that can introduce bias to research. So some people refer to these, like I said, as questionable research practices. So things like conflicts of interest, post hoc selection of statistical techniques to support a priori hypotheses, I think also referred to as p-hacking. So again, I run a bunch of statistical analyses, right? And then I select the ones that are going to best meet whatever my previous hypotheses might have been, right? I want to pick the ones that will look like they match my hypothesis. And then of course, ideally the ones that are significant so that I can say, oh, look, my hypothesis was correct, because at the end of the day, here's the analyses that I conducted that show support whatever my hypothesis might have been or not been, right? It could be the opposite as well.
Can I ask you a question regarding that?
Yeah, of course.
How do you feel about SPSS giving outputs of different types of statistical analyses for their p-values?
How do I feel about it?
Yeah, because I would think when I'm reading this, for at least for the p-hacking part, is that the individual it might realize, like, well, if I look at, I can't remember them because they're not from, like, but Hunfeld gives me significant value, whereas like a sphericity assumed, I think as was on there, doesn't meet significance.
Right. Yeah, I think it could definitely lead to problems because, again, it's kind of like people are searching for what best meets my hypothesis, right? Or doesn't meet my hypothesis, depending upon what the research question is. So I think it can be tempting, like if I'm running a bunch of analyses, to have those data available and then search for something that might best represent what I want to happen, right? It's almost like self-fulfilling prophecy or whatever it's called. I can't remember what exactly that phrase, but I think it could be dangerous in that respect. I think that, good researchers would advise, like, you go into, your study or your research questions and you already have planned, like, okay, these are the analyses I'm going to run based on what makes sense in the way that my methodology and my groups and stuff. And so that way it's like, okay, I ran these analyses that I said I was going to run, and I either, you get the results that you get. You obviously don't know until you run the analyses. But if I leave it more open to like a post hoc, like, okay, I'm going to just start searching for things that might meet what I want, then I think that's when it becomes a little dangerous, right? Because then I'm tempted to be like, oh, well, this looks good because it shows that it's significant or whatever the case might be. But then I'm going to be tempted to use those analyses probably, right? I'm not going to just put them away because now I've seen them.
Well, no, I agree.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. For me, it becomes a hard subject because I at first want to think, well, hopefully we've come up with the methods that allow us to compensate for this in the statistical analysis. I think specifically about the Bonferroni correction, but I don't know how useful those measures are when you see multiple outputs and one gives you significance. Do you take the one that gives you significance or not? But thank you.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think the more that you can set up, I think, beforehand, and sometimes I realize that that's not always, I guess, available, but as best you can, like, go into it a priori, so that way you're not searching later, like, what can I find that will match what I want to happen or think should happen. I think will help minimize that. But again, I know sometimes that doesn't always necessarily work. But I do think there's other ways that you can mitigate it, and just trying to be thoughtful before you go down that rabbit hole, I think, is helpful. Selectively reporting, we've kind of talked about that one already. Outright suppression. So again, if I have some variables that are not significant, if I just completely say, I'm not going to report those because, I just convinced myself they're not relevant or important or whatever, and then obscure those data from ever being reported or, being shared in any way. So we see the same thing. So the ones I just mentioned were a little bit more relevant when you have group means and looking at statistical significance. But again, it's, this problem, unfortunately, is ubiquitous across all areas. So it's not just like, oh, it doesn't happen in single case design or it doesn't happen in group design. Unfortunately, it happens everywhere, right? So we see things like participant selection. So if I'm looking for, I want to run this new intervention with kids with autism, I could very easily say, well, I want to show that, maybe I'm trying to increase eye contact, right? Just as an example. So maybe I look for kids that like are very social and maybe, I interact with them in our brief interview and I say, oh, okay, this kid, clearly has a lot of social skills and is very talkative and, maybe is on the higher end in terms of severity, like as far as less severe. So if I'm very selective about the kind of kids that I want to enter my study, that could obviously be very questionable and a big research bias because, I'm not necessarily taking into consideration kids on the spectrum that might be at different, that might have different characteristics, and that could definitely be a biased way to look at this, right? Especially if I don't necessarily report that later either. I might be like, oh, this treatment was really effective to teach eye contact, and fail to mention like, oh, but I also chose kids that were super social and, we're already making tons of eye contact, right? That could be definitely a limitation or a confound. DB selections, I think Matt said this earlier. So again, how am I selecting which variables are going to be my dependent measures? How am I going to measure them, right? You can pick certain ways to measure variables or data that might be more, that might highlight your data better than other ways. So that can be something to consider. Procedural fidelity. So thinking about, are these procedures even being implemented correctly or accurately? And that's a problem if not, right? I forgot in each of these sections, I'm actually going to highlight a couple things. So I forgot about that. So inclusion criteria, this is a way that we can definitely help mitigate this, right? So if I say, I'm going to run this treatment on eye contact, I'm only going to take kids between 2 to 5. They need to have, an IQ within the, less than 70 range, let's say, if I want them to have some kind of IDD, right? So I can have very specific criteria. So I'm not like searching around looking for kids that I think are going to be most amenable to my treatment, right? So having these clear inclusion criteria, having randomization procedures can help with that, right? Because then I'm not like picking and choosing who's going to be in which group or who's going to be in which part of my study. I'm going to just randomize it and not be selective over that. When it comes to DV selection, having very clear operational definitions, and like I said, clear data collection procedures that are ideally chosen up front and not necessarily waiting until I know what might highlight my data in the best light. Procedural fidelity. So ideally this should be done blinded, right? We should have people that aren't necessarily familiar with the treatment or the interventions that are happening, and they have checklists that they're using to score, like, are these procedures being done correctly? But ideally they shouldn't know what the purposes of the study are, right? They're just watching and taking data. But if I know, like, okay, this person's supposed to be changing this behavior or doing this thing, automatically that's going to put some bias in my behavior because we're human, right? So if I know what's going on or what should be going on, that is automatically going to be skewing my perception of how I'm collecting data. So ideally what should really happen is that people that are doing this should be blinded, right? They shouldn't know what the purpose of the study is. They may not even know if they're watching treatment or the control or if they're in baseline or anything like that, right? That would be like a perfect situation in which I'm not sure what's happening. So therefore I'm less likely to have any kind of preconceived determinations about what I'm observing or not observing. And then graphical displays. So this can also be very misperceiving too. So sometimes you'll look at graphs and you'll notice that for across individuals, if you're thinking like, again, single case design, I might have 5 kids or 5 adults. Some of them might have, their axes scaled to like 100. Other people might have it scaled to 50. Other people might have it scaled to 20. And if I don't catch that, I'm just kind of visually looking across all the data. I might be like, oh, wow, like some of these kids are scoring really high, not realizing that the axes are actually not at 100% Some axes are at 10, some are at 2, and of course that is different, right? The measures there are different, but they might look similar depending upon me as the investigator, how I set the graphs up. So we want to make sure that we're not, and that could be unintentional, right? Like maybe I really just didn't think like, oh, if I'm having 5 kids, I should have them all have the same exact axes so that you can do a straight comparison across kids or adults or whoever it is. But obviously that does happen, and that can definitely cause me as the reader to misinterpret what I'm looking at if I'm not clear that that's what is actually happening. And then publication bias can be, oh, we had 5 kids, I'm only going to report 4 of them because 4 of them, have data that on these graphs look really pretty and look great. And then the other person that, maybe didn't have good responding, I just omitted them, or maybe I say like data available upon request or something like that, right? So that can definitely be a problem as well. All right, I'm just going to show one more slide because I realize that we're getting close on time. Or actually, I'm going to show, I think, 2 more slides, and then if there's any questions or anything. So one of my students actually did what's called a risk of bias assessment. So I thought I would just throw this in here. So based on a lot of the things that I just talked about, like the questionable research practices, some of the other things I talked about at the beginning. So there is a tool. There's one for group designs, and then there's one for single case designs. So it's a little bit subjective, so I don't love it per se, but it was kind of a good starting point. So basically we read some articles and we both scored, the level of bias across different categories. So you can see here, hopefully with my mouse on the left, the different categories that they had as in their tool. So we basically just utilized the tool. We didn't come up with the categories or anything. And we rated it based on low bias, high bias, and unclear. And we just wanted to see like overall what was the level of bias. And so this little red, light, and not red and blue, green, yellow, red graphic shows you in like a stack bar graph kind of fashion the level of bias for each of these categories. So you can see it kind of as an aggregated display. And then on the bottom, this table, you can see it's broken down by each of the studies. And then you can see across each of the domains. So like there's some domains like D4, D5 here, that there's a lot of red. I think those had to do with like blinding. So like where the data collectors blinded, where the people that were implementing the study, like the procedures, were they blinded? And so for a lot of them, they were not. Some of them, it was unclear, as you can see with the yellows, but there was different categories that we basically rated the studies on just to see if we could identify, for one, what the overall level of bias was in these studies, but then for 2, we also wanted to know if there were certain categories that had more bias than others. And so you can see under the results that lots of bias related to blinding, as I mentioned, and not having sufficient procedural fidelity, looking at how the procedures were implemented, and then lower bias here was like data sampling and also participant selection bias. So that was actually a good thing based on, we've already talked about that a little bit, where people were more clear in how they were selecting participants and had clear inclusion criteria and stuff like that. So this is obviously just one sample of articles that we looked at. So there definitely needs to be more research on this, but it was just kind of a preliminary, like I said, starting point just to see how the tool worked, how it was, how effective it was. As I mentioned, there was a lot of subjectivity, which I think made it difficult for us to agree on certain scoring. So there are some things that I definitely would like to suggest to future people that use this, that they can hopefully make it a little bit more objective and not so subjective across raters. Okay, so the last thing I'll show, and then, like I said, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer. So the controlled consecutive case series design, like I showed, at least in my field, behavior analysis and psychology, I think in general, it's not super well known, but I think it's definitely a good tool that kind of can lead us towards addressing some of these areas, again, like selection bias, publication bias, can give us a better picture of like how effective some of the interventions and therapies and other things that we're interested in actually are, without, weeding out these people or these cases where they're not having success. So it allows us to report on things even if they don't meet the expectations or the hypotheses that we might have wanted them to, right? So for me, most of the ones that have been done in my area have been focused on like challenging behavior treatments. And we've had, several articles, probably like 10 to 15 thus far that have come out over the last few years. And that's great. So I want to continue to be able to do some in that area as I have here, but also looking at other interventions that teach language, communication, that kind of stuff. So that we can also, just continue to generalize it across different interventions, different fields, help address, again, some of this publication bias that we're seeing, and ultimately just allow us to report on some of the outcomes that we have, regardless of the outcome, right? So it doesn't matter if the significance was there or if the treatment was effective or not, it still gets the information out to people without worrying about, oh, it's not going to get published. Oh, the journals aren't going to accept it, because we're still able to report on some positive outcomes. It just is reporting on a bunch of outcomes. So it's not so much focusing on the negative, but it's trying to embed it within all the findings, if that makes sense. All right, so that is all I have. So I had to skip over some of my examples, but hopefully you guys were able to get some of the gist of what I was providing as far as just examples of how to use that design. And then other ways, again, I don't have the answers, unfortunately, for how to mitigate research bias and all that, but I definitely am open to discussion on it. And if you guys have ideas, I'm definitely open to hearing what you guys think, because it's definitely a problem. And people need to be talking about it, and people need to be thinking about ways to address it so that we can share our data more widely without worrying about it, right?
Phone wanted to ask, is there any common resources or sources of bias in research studies, and how can we minimize their impact? I guess they're asking, besides the idea of an intentional, this might be an old comment since it was a direct one to me. I think you kind of answered this in the paper or later in the
About
presentation.
addressing bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like Cochrane has a risk of bias tool, and then the one that I presented on was just by a group of researchers. It's not why it's even I think it was published in 2018, I think, but it's not widely used. Like now that if you guys are familiar at all with like when you do systematic reviews, the Prisma guidelines, when you go through that checklist, do you guys know what I'm talking about?
Oh no, please share.
Okay, so Prisma is I don't know what you would consider them, but basically they have guidelines for doing systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And so in their checklist, which I can actually probably share it on here, they basically say, like, if you submit your systematic review, you have to address their checklist of things. And it's all meant to be like transparent, right? So usually if you guys have seen like the little flow charts that they have in systematic reviews, it'll say like this number of articles screened, this number of articles included, this number of articles excluded, and you put like the reasons, if you guys have seen those little flow charts before. But on the checklist, I can share it here really quick. You have to basically address, oops, hold on, it says.
I'm just going to drop, I think, what's the website in case someone else wants to see it also with your stuff.
Yeah, it's like transparent reporting of systematic reviews. I don't know why it's saying I can't share again, but yeah, so there's like a checklist that allows you, so they often want you to, maybe this will share. Can you guys see that? No? Okay. I don't know what's going on with my screen share, but they often want you to address the checklist and say, we reported these things or we didn't report these things, depending upon what data you have. So that's one way. And so one of the things they ask for now, this just got updated in 2020, I think, is reporting bias. And so you have to say, like, describe any methods used to assess risk of bias. And so there's different mechanisms now of things coming out that you can use, but I haven't found one yet that I really like. But one would be, yeah, there you go.
Sorry, I'm just not sure how to give you. It says you have access, but it's not giving it to you for some reason, I'm guessing. But this is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so if you go to like number 11, yeah, so it says specify methods, and then you'll, in the results section, it also will say report on the results of your risk of bias. And it comes up several times. So now it's like, if you're doing a systematic review, it's basically like the gold standard is you have to use either Prisma or I think Cochrane has like guidelines that you'd have to follow. But those are like the two that people are using now across like health and medical and scientific fields. So now I think definitely in the top tier journals, they would expect you to say, I use this risk of bias assessment. And then in the results section, it comes up again, like I mentioned, where it says, report on the results of your risk of bias. And if you don't have those things, then they're probably, I don't know if they would reject it per se, but they would definitely question, like, why didn't you use something like this? Or, you know, if it was a lower tier journal, you might be able to get away with it and just list it as a limitation. But if it's a higher tier journal, I think they're definitely going to ask for it. So that's one way. And then, like I said, I think in my field, it's very uncommon. So like, there's probably maybe a handful of systematic reviews that a lot of them use the Prisma checklist now, but not a lot of them actually do the risk of bias. Like they'll just put NA or something, which is a problem still. So I think that in the years to come, it'll become more mandated. And I think in other fields, like medical fields, and other like larger science fields, I think that it's basically expected, like you need to do some kind of risk of bias, because that's how you need to report the outcomes and then tell people like these studies are severely biased, or no, these studies are not biased, or whatever the outcome might be, right? So I think that is going to be more and more reported on over the years. So yeah, so for any of you doing systematic reviews or meta-analyses or stuff like that, definitely look at Prisma. And then the other one, like I said, I think is Cochrane. But either way, those are both good ways to follow their guidelines and then report the ways that they report, or the ways that they recommend. So that, but that's just, I mean, those are just systematic reviews of existing research, right? So that doesn't necessarily get at the problem of, if I'm conducting research, like empirical research, how do I avoid bias or minimize bias? Being familiar with what's in those risk of bias tools can help to get you thinking about it. But again, there's some things that are just going to be, you have to be very, I guess, like thinking about it from the start of your project to the end of it, right? So I think that's also important to keep in mind, like, okay, I need to have blinded people taking data, I need to have blinded people running my procedures, and that's sometimes very difficult to do. So, but knowing what the categories of bias are that are most common, I think can then influence how you set your projects up and how you run your projects and all that good stuff.